exchange secret agreements that can break the ice. But the most important foundation on which future relations will depend is the personal trust that evolves between the people of America and the people of China. And the realization that grows among all people in the world that this is probably, I think without question, the most important bilateral relationship on which world peace and future economic progress depends. I was just reading the New York Times this morning, and one of the major articles in the New York Times, which I think John may have mentioned, is that European leaders are distressed because they have been in the forefront of the issue of global warming leading up to the Copenhagen meeting. But now, since President Obama is coming there and the Prime Minister of China is coming there, they'll be in the distant background, because what really matters 10, 15, 20 years down the line on this issue of climate change is what is decided in Beijing and what's decided in Washington. And the cooperation between our two countries is crucial to the effectiveness of decisions made in either capital. That's just one example of many things that shows how important this relationship is. And I think all of Americans realize that when President Obama was in Beijing just recently, he realized we owe you $800 billion. So we have to be a little bit careful about our major creditor and make sure that the American dollars stay sound so that the tremendous deficit that we're going to have in our budget this year, $1 trillion, somebody will lend us some money to pay that difference. And the main place we'll go to get the money is from China. So those ties of military cooperation and understanding and economic development and climate change and people exchange, all of them are rapidly growing in importance to ourselves and to the rest of the world.
In the communique between Hu Jintao and President Obama, they did have reference to areas where they agreed to disagree. A concern of yours over many years is human rights. It's important for our two peoples, I think, to realize that internally we have very complex processes. I think the Chinese are accustomed to seeing the kind of debates going on in the U.S. Congress and between the Congress and the presidency. But for us Americans trying to understand the increasing complexity of China, we rely on Yahweh's website and other sort of avenues in, but it would be nice if you could talk a bit about, President Carter, what kind of advice are you going to give in your next book when you reflect on your presidency and you're saying that President Obama has some of the same issues, including China? Do you have any thoughts on how to avoid misunderstandings that could arise over very sensitive internal issues?
Well, yesterday I lectured in Mary's class, and one of the questions I got from a student was, how does the United States preach to China on human rights when we have Guantanamo prison still open, and the United States has been guilty of torture, even acknowledged by American leaders as legitimate, in prisons like Abu Ghraib, with horrible photographs made. And I told them we don't have the right to preach to others. We have a difference of opinion about basic human rights, and it's very, very important. If you ask the average American on the street to define the most important human rights, they would automatically say freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, trial by jury, and that would just about be it. But if you ask somebody in a developing country like China about human rights, they would say a right to have a decent home, and to have a job, and to have a right to education, and the right to health care, as well as the right to have a voice in the selection of our own leaders. So that the definition of human rights is quite different. It's almost mandatory for a president when he goes to China now to talk about Tibet and to talk about the Uyghurs in the far distant western part of China. But we have to be careful not to preach to others because China looks upon that question in quite a different way. One of the pressures on the Chinese government in the last 10 or 15 years, not imposed by us but by their own people, is how to equalize the tremendous economic benefits that have come from the free enterprise system in China. Because along the coastal area of China, to simplify, they've had fairly rapid increase in per capita income, living standards. But on the far western part and in places like Tibet, the progress has been very slow. So the Chinese feel a need to improve the economic status of those distant communities. And they send in Han Chinese to improve their economic status. And in the process, some of the customs and religious commitments of those distant groups have become challenged. So we have to understand the reason for Chinese government decisions. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't all insist on human rights as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which every member of the United Nations has adopted. So, a difference in interpretation, yes. Mutual respect, yes. And insistence on perfect human rights for both countries, yes. But that is one of those issues where we disagree, but we have to learn how not to be disagreeable to the extent of estrangement.
Would you add any on that list, Yahweh?
Very quickly, I think Paige is walking on the stage, so it's time to take questions. But misunderstanding, I think, by the Americans of China has been so much in the politicking of the United States, from Truman downwards to Nixon, it's containing China. And from Nixon to President Carter, it's engagement of China. And then suddenly it became China has to be contained and engaged at the same time, so call that congagement. And then President Bush in 2005 said, we're actually responsible stakeholders. And then early this year, President Obama now is changing that perception of China into something called strategic reassurance. The Chinese side is kind of confused. What kind of strategy do you want us to reassure? In terms of bilateral relationship, China has no intention nor capability to challenge the supremacy of the United States. So as far as the Chinese leaders are concerned, we're not going to challenge the U.S., but the U.S. seems to be a little nervous, indication of maybe China as a rising economic power is going to replace. So I think the two sides really need to come together and see the true intention of each other, and that intention is to improve the understanding of each other so that, as I mentioned, I think Madame Lee mentioned about McDonald's, there's the theory of golden arch. Countries with McDonald's don't ever fight each other, so we hope that's not the case.
Because I think China is a country with 5,000 years, we think, splendid history.